I never meant for things to turn out like this, son.
I know, Dad. I just needed to hear you say it.
We're here now. That's what matters. I wish you were here to see this, Ruth. The house, it's going.
I haven't seen you in years. It's good to be back, son.
Yeah, it is.
I'm leaving for Pittsburgh this week.
Why don't you have some pot roast?
I'm not hungry, Dad.
I never stopped loving you, son.
I know, Dad. I'm sorry I stayed away.
It's time, all of us. Together.
The blue plate was already waiting at the empty chair when Claire Callahan pulled into her father's driveway and saw the for sale sign leaning in the front yard like a quiet accusation. It was Sunday in Mill Creek, Ohio, just after 5 in the evening, the hour when the neighborhood smelled faintly of cut grass, charcoal smoke, and somebody's laundry turning warm in a dryer. In the Callahan house, Sunday had always smelled like pot roast, black coffee, and the kind of silence people passed down without meaning to. Eddie Callahan was 68 years old, though he had looked older since Ruth died. He moved through the kitchen with the slow care of a man who knew exactly where everything belonged because almost everything else in his life had already been taken out of place. The roast sat cooling beneath foil. The mashed potatoes waited in a chipped white bowl. Green beans steamed lightly on the stove. 3 places had been set with forks, napkins, and water glasses. But at the far side of the table, beneath the window that faced the maple tree, Eddie had placed the 4th setting. The blue plate with the hairline crack near the rim. The good napkin folded beside it. A clean fork. A knife. A glass filled halfway with ice water, though no one had touched it in 17 years. Claire stood in the doorway holding a grocery bag against her hip and watched her father straighten the fork by less than an inch. He did not look embarrassed. He never did. That was the hardest part. Every Sunday, he set that plate as if Aaron might walk in late, shrug off a work jacket, and say the highway was bad. Every Sunday, the chair stayed empty. And every Sunday, Claire helped clear a place that had never been used. Outside, the for sale sign shifted in the wind. Eddie had agreed to sell the house only because the stairs had become too much, the roof needed work, and the doctors had started using gentle words that meant he should not live alone much longer. But Claire knew the real reason the house was hard to leave. It was not the mortgage papers, or Ruth's recipe cards, or the pencil marks on the pantry door showing Aaron and Claire growing taller year by year. It was that table. It was that chair. It was the blue plate, waiting with a patience no person should have to live beside. Claire set the grocery bag down and said, softer than she intended, "Dad, you know this has to be the last time." Eddie's hand paused over the water glass. For a moment, the kitchen clock seemed too loud. He looked at the plate, then at the window, then at the place across from him where Ruth used to sit and pretend not to notice when his pride got in the way of his heart. Last time for what? He asked, though both of them knew. Claire swallowed. She was 42 now, old enough to have a son of her own in college, old enough to understand grief, but not old enough to stop feeling like the daughter who stayed and still somehow lost to the son who left. For setting his place, she said. Eddie did not answer. He only touched the rim of the blue plate with 2 fingers, the way some men might touch a photograph or a headstone or a door they were afraid to open. The house held its breath around them. And then, before Claire could say anything else, headlights swept across the kitchen wall. A car had stopped outside, not at the curb, in the driveway. Eddie turned slowly toward the sound. Claire stepped to the window and saw a young woman standing near the porch with a canvas bag over one shoulder and something small wrapped in both hands. She looked nervous. She looked like she had driven a long way and changed her mind 3 times before knocking. When she finally lifted her hand, Eddie did not move. Claire opened the door instead. The girl on the porch could not have been more than 17. She had Aaron's eyes. In her hands was a blue ceramic cup, old and carefully kept, the exact color of the plate waiting at the empty chair. "I'm sorry," the girl said, her voice trembling but polite. "My name is Grace Callahan. My dad told me this belonged beside the plate." For a moment, no one in the Callahan house seemed to understand how to move. Claire stood in the doorway with one hand still on the knob, staring at the blue ceramic cup as if it had crossed 17 years by itself. Eddie remained by the table, his fingers resting near the cracked plate, his face drained of every ordinary expression he wore to survive a Sunday. The young woman on the porch held the cup carefully, both palms around it, not like a dish, but like something that had been trusted to her. She had brown hair tucked behind one ear, a gray sweatshirt from some Pittsburgh high school, and Aaron's eyes so plainly that Claire felt the past step into the doorway before the girl did. Grace, Claire repeated, because the name needed somewhere to land. The girl nodded. Yes, ma'am. That small politeness broke something in Eddie's chest. He took one step forward, then stopped, as if crossing the kitchen was easier than crossing all the words he had never said. The porch light had come on behind Grace, though the sky was not fully dark yet. It made her look younger, and for a second Claire remembered Aaron at 19, standing in that same doorway with a duffel bag, trying not to let anybody see how badly he wanted to be asked to stay. Come in, Claire said, because Eddie could not find his voice. Grace stepped inside slowly. Her shoes made almost no sound on the old linoleum. She looked around the kitchen the way people look inside a house they have heard about all their lives, but never expected to enter. Her eyes moved from the stove to the recipe cards taped inside a cabinet door, then to the maple table beneath the window. When she saw the fourth place setting, she stopped. Not dramatically, not with tears. She simply became still. The blue plate was waiting there, clean and useless and faithful. The empty chair sat tucked close to the table, as if someone had pushed it in after leaving for just a minute. Claire had hated that chair for years. She hated how carefully her father dusted it. She hated how no one put a coat over it. No one stacked mail on it. No one let it become ordinary furniture. Guests noticed, but never asked. Ruth's church friends used to glance at it during holiday meals and then look down at their pie. Claire's son, when he was little, once tried to sit there and had been gently moved to another chair before anyone explained why. That was how silence worked in the Callahan house. It did not shout. It arranged the furniture. It decided where people sat. It made a clean plate heavier than a full one. Grace walked toward the table and placed the cup beside the blue plate. The colors matched almost perfectly, though the cup was worn at the handle and had a faint chip near the lip. Eddie stared at it as if it had a voice. He kept it, he whispered. Grace looked at him. He said it was the last thing he took from home that still felt like home. Claire looked away first. She did not want to resent a 17-year-old girl who had done nothing wrong, but something hot and old rose in her throat. For years, she had sat at this table while her father grieved a son who was alive somewhere, breathing somewhere, choosing not to call. She had paid bills, driven him to appointments, fixed the porch rail, cooked Ruth's roast badly twice before learning to make it right. She had stayed. Yet the room had always left its softest place open for Aaron. Eddie reached for the back of the empty chair, but did not pull it out. His hand trembled once and went still. Grace saw it. Claire saw it. And in that quiet, the kitchen became what it had always been. Not a room where a family ate, but a room where a family practiced not saying one name too loudly. Before the chair became sacred, before the plate became a promise, before Claire learned to measure love by who was missing, that seat had belonged to the loudest boy in the house. Back then, before the house learned how to lower its voice, Aaron Callahan could fill the kitchen without trying. He was 19 in the summer of 2009, all long arms, restless feet, and grease under his fingernails from fixing anything in Mill Creek that coughed, stalled, or refused to start. Lawn mowers, bicycles, radios, old pickup trucks from neighbors who paid him in cash, peach pie, or sometimes nothing but thanks. He had a way of leaning over an engine like he was listening to a secret. Ruth used to say the boy could hear what was broken before the rest of the world admitted there was a problem. On Sunday evenings, he came home smelling like gasoline, soap, and July heat, and Ruth would make him wash his hands twice before letting him touch the dinner rolls. Claire was 25 then, already working at the county office, already responsible in the way oldest daughters sometimes become before anyone asks them whether they wanted the job. She loved Aaron, but she rolled her eyes at him often, mostly because he made being forgiven look easy. He would steal a carrot from the cutting board, kiss Ruth on the cheek, tease Claire about her neat handwriting, and slide into the chair beneath the window, as if the whole table had been built around his return. Eddie sat at the head of the table, broad-shouldered from years of driving school buses and carrying other people's children safely through snow, rain, and back roads. He was proud of that. He was proud of never missing a shift, proud of mowing his own yard, proud of paying bills on time, even when there was not much left afterward. In Eddie's world, a man showed love by staying. He showed love by working the same route, keeping the same house, showing up before sunrise, and coming home before dark. Aaron did not understand that yet. Or maybe he understood it too well and wanted a different kind of life anyway. That summer, he had been accepted into an apprenticeship program at a diesel repair shop outside Pittsburgh, 200 miles away. It was not college, not fancy, not the kind of dream people put on Christmas cards, but to Aaron it meant movement. It meant learning from people who knew more than he did. It meant a paycheck, a rented room, a bus ticket out, and the chance to become someone whose hands did more than patch the same old broken things in the same old town. For weeks, he carried the letter folded in his back pocket, waiting for the right moment to tell his father. Ruth knew. Claire suspected. Eddie pretended not to notice the way Aaron grew quiet whenever Pittsburgh came on the evening news. The last Good Sunday arrived with rain tapping lightly against the kitchen windows. Ruth made pot roast with carrots and onions, the way she always did when she wanted the family to sit longer than usual. The blue plates were set out. The matching cups waited beside them. Aaron sat at his place beneath the window, turning his cup slowly between his hands. He looked young enough to still be someone's boy and old enough to leave if no one asked him to stay. When he finally cleared his throat, Ruth lowered her eyes to her napkin. Claire stopped cutting her potatoes. Eddie kept his fork in his hand, but did not lift it. "I got the spot," Aaron said. "The apprenticeship in Pittsburgh. They want me there by the end of August." The rain kept touching the glass. Ruth reached for Aaron's hand under the table, but he was looking at Eddie. He had always looked at Eddie first. For approval. For argument. For proof that wanting more did not mean loving less. Eddie stared at his son for a long moment. And in that silence something old woke up in him, something Aaron had not put there but would soon pay for. Because long before Aaron dreamed of leaving Mill Creek, Eddie had once been the child left watching a door that never opened again. Eddie Callahan did not become a man who feared leaving all at once. It happened slowly, long before Aaron was born, in a two-bedroom house outside Dayton where the paint peeled near the windows and his mother kept a jar of grocery money behind the flour. Eddie had been 8 the morning his father packed a brown suitcase and told him he was only going away for a little while. That was the sentence Eddie remembered most clearly. Not the sound of the car. Not his mother standing at the sink with both hands flat on the counter. Not the screen door closing. Just those few words, spoken as if leaving could be made gentle by naming it something smaller. A little while. Eddie waited for that little while to end for almost a year. He waited after school with his coat still on. He waited on birthdays. He waited when the phone rang. He waited until waiting became embarrassing, then private, then hard inside him. His mother never said much about it. She went to work at a laundromat, took in mending from women at church, and taught Eddie how to stretch soup with potatoes. But some lessons do not need to be spoken. Eddie learned that people who loved you could still walk out the door. He learned that a chair could accuse a room just by being empty. He learned that a boy could become quiet enough that adults stopped asking what he missed. By the time he married Ruth, he had built his whole life around the opposite of leaving. He bought a small house in Mill Creek and stayed in it. He took the school bus job and kept it for decades. He shoveled the same driveway every winter, sat in the same church pew, drank coffee from the same mug, and paid for every repair before buying anything new. To Ruth, there was something tender beneath all that stubbornness. She saw the boy in him who had once watched a road too long. She also saw the danger. A man can love his family so fiercely that he begins to mistake stillness for safety. When Aaron was little, Eddie adored him in practical ways. He taught him how to check tire pressure, how to hold a flashlight steady, how to shake a man's hand without squeezing too hard. He came to every school concert, even when Aaron stood in the back row pretending not to sing. He fixed Claire's bicycle and Aaron's toy trucks and Ruth's loose cabinet door without being asked. But when Aaron grew older and started looking beyond Mill Creek, Eddie heard more than ambition. He heard a suitcase being latched in another room. He heard a screen door. He heard a promise shrinking into a little while. So that rainy Sunday in 2009, when Aaron said Pittsburgh wanted him by the end of August, Eddie did not see a young man trying to become useful in the world. He saw a son preparing to make an empty chair. Ruth watched Eddie's face change before he spoke. Claire saw it too. though she did not yet understand what had risen behind his eyes. Aaron sat there with the blue cup between his hands, waiting for his father to bless the leaving. But Eddie had never learned how to bless the thing that once broke him. The words gathered in him, heavy and wrong, and by the time he opened his mouth, love had already put on the voice of pride. The sentence did not sound cruel until it was already sitting on the table between them. Eddie looked at Aaron across the pot roast and the blue plates, with rain ticking softly against the kitchen glass, and said, "A son who walks out does not need a place at this table." Ruth closed her eyes as if the words had entered the room too fast to stop. Claire set her fork down. Aaron did not move at first. He kept both hands around the blue cup, turning it once, then stopping with his thumb on the chipped place near the handle. He had expected anger. He had expected questions about rent, money, safety, and whether Pittsburgh people knew how to drive in snow. He had even expected his father to call the idea foolish. But he had not expected the table to be taken from him. That was what made the kitchen go still. Not the raised voice, because Eddie had not raised his voice. Not an argument, because Aaron did not argue back. It was the quiet discovery that a place could disappear while a person was still sitting in it. Ruth reached for Eddie under the table, but his hands were folded now, hard and useless in front of his plate. "Edward," she said softly. She only used his full name when she was trying to pull him back from himself. Eddie looked down, but he did not correct it. Pride is strange that way. Sometimes it makes a man defend a wound he never meant to pass on. Aaron nodded once, not because he agreed, but because something inside him had learned there was no safe answer. He pushed his chair back. The wooden legs scraped the floor louder than they should have. Claire wanted to say his name, but her throat tightened around it. She was old enough to know that families did not always break in one dramatic moment. Sometimes they broke because every person in the room waited for someone else to become brave first. Aaron walked to the sink and rinsed his cup, though he had barely touched the water in it. That small act would return to Eddie for years. The careful rinse. The towel folded over the rim. The boy trying to leave no mess behind. Ruth stood then, her napkin falling from her lap. "Aaron, wait," she said. He stopped near the back door, the blue cup in his hand. "I am not leaving because I do not love you," he said. His voice was steady, which made it worse. "I am leaving because I think I can become something." Eddie stared at the tablecloth. He had 100 better sentences available to him and chose none of them. Ruth crossed the room and held Aaron's face in both hands. She whispered something too low for Claire to hear. Whatever it was, Aaron swallowed hard and nodded. Then he looked at Eddie one last time. Not with hate. That would have been easier. He looked at him with the terrible hope of a son giving his father one more chance. Eddie did not take it. Aaron picked up the duffel bag he had already packed and stepped into the rainy evening through the back door. The screen door eased shut behind him with a soft wooden sigh. No one followed. No one called him back. For several minutes, the family sat with the sound of the rain and the smell of dinner cooling on their plates. Later, Eddie would remember the exact shape of the empty chair, the wet mark Aaron's shoes left near the door, and the missing cup from the table set. But that night, he told himself a stubborn lie. He told himself the boy would come home by morning. He did not know that by sunrise, Ruth would set one blue plate at Aaron's chair, and that small act would become the only apology the house knew how to make. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the house still sounded wet with everything no one had said. Eddie came downstairs before 6, the way he always did, and found Ruth standing in the kitchen in her robe with the overhead light off and the small lamp by the stove glowing yellow. She had not slept much. Neither had he. The back door was locked. Aaron's work boots were gone. The duffel bag was gone. The blue cup was gone. But the chair beneath the window remained pulled out just slightly, as if Aaron had only stepped away to answer the phone. Eddie stood in the doorway and looked at it. He wanted to say the boy would be back. He wanted to say stubbornness ran in the family and would burn itself out by lunchtime. He wanted to say Pittsburgh was 200 miles away and nobody with sense left home with less than $80 in his wallet and a second-hand car that needed a new belt. Instead, he said, nothing. Ruth opened the cabinet and took down one of the blue plates. Eddie watched her set it at Aaron's place. A fork, a knife, a napkin, a water glass. Simple things, ordinary things. But in the quiet kitchen, each one landed with the weight of a decision. Ruth, Eddie said. She did not turn around. He left. I know. He took what he wanted. She paused then, her hand resting on the back of Aaron's chair. "No," she said softly. He took what he thought he was allowed to keep. Eddie looked toward the sink, where Aaron had rinsed the cup the night before, where the towel still hung crooked over the edge. He could feel the sentence he had spoken sitting somewhere inside his chest, heavy and unclaimed. But shame, when it first arrives, often dresses itself as anger. "You heard what he said," Eddie murmured. Ruth turned to him then. Her hair was pinned loosely at the back of her neck, and her eyes looked tired in a way he had seen only after funerals and hospital waiting rooms. "I heard what you said, too." Eddie looked away first. Outside, a truck passed on Maple Street, tires whispering over damp pavement. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and stopped. The world was already continuing, which felt unfair. Ruth went to the refrigerator, took out the roast from the night before, and began slicing it for sandwiches Aaron would not eat. Eddie watched her move with the calm of a woman who knew love sometimes had to keep working while pride sat useless at the table. "A door can be closed with words," she said. "It can be opened with dinner." Eddie almost answered. He almost said he had not meant it that way. He almost said a father had a right to be hurt. He almost said Aaron should have understood. But all of those sentences asked the wounded person to do the forgiving before the one who caused the wound had learned how to apologize. So he stood there, silent, while Ruth wrapped 2 sandwiches in wax paper and placed them in the refrigerator, as if a hungry son might come home later and need proof that someone had expected him. That Sunday, she cooked again. Not a full roast, because the house did not have the appetite for it, but enough to make. The kitchen smelled like invitation. Claire came over after church and saw the plate. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Even then, she understood that some family rituals begin as hope before they become burden. Eddie sat at the head of the table and did not look at Aaron's chair. Ruth served everyone. Then, before saying grace, she laid one small piece of roast on the blue plate. Eddie's hand tightened around his fork. "He is not here," he said. Ruth bowed her head. "Then let the plate say what you cannot." Years later, after Ruth was gone, Eddie would try to remember the exact sound of her voice when she said it. He would search for it on lonely Sundays, in the clink of silverware, in the steam rising from green beans, in the kitchen clock ticking above the sink. He did not know then that Ruth was teaching him the last language she would leave behind, or that one day, when the sun still had not returned, that blue plate would become both his punishment and his prayer. Years passed in the Callahan house the way dust gathers on a windowsill, quietly enough that no one notices the first layer, then all at once enough to write a name in. At first, Ruth set the blue plate with a kind of stubborn hope. She would cook too much roast, save an extra slice of pie, and leave the porch light on until Eddie muttered about the electric bill. She mailed birthday cards to the last address Aaron had written on a scrap of paper, a rented room above a tire shop outside Pittsburgh. Sometimes the cards came back. Sometimes they did not. When they did not, Ruth held the silence like it meant delivery instead of disappearance. Eddie pretended not to watch the mailbox. Claire pretended not to see him watching. Sundays became a small play everyone knew by heart. Ruth cooked. Eddie carved. Claire poured iced tea. The blue plate waited beneath the window with a napkin folded beside it, and no one said Aaron's name unless Ruth said it first in prayer. At 26, Claire married Daniel Reed at the Methodist Church on Maple Street, and Aaron's seat in the second pew stayed empty. Ruth placed a program in it anyway. At 30, Claire brought her baby boy, Noah, to Sunday dinner, and Ruth held him near the table and whispered, "That is your Uncle Aaron's chair." Eddie heard her and looked toward the window, but he did not correct her. Pride had begun to tire inside him by then. It no longer stood tall. It sat in corners. It cleared its throat. It waited for someone else to begin. Aaron called only twice in those early years. The first time, Ruth answered and stepped into the laundry room with the cord stretched tight from the wall phone. Eddie stayed at the table, pretending to read the newspaper while every part of him listened for his own name. Ruth came back with wet eyes and said Aaron was working hard, renting a small apartment, and doing fine. Eddie said, "Good," because he did not know how to ask whether his son had mentioned him. The second call came on a Tuesday night while Eddie was outside salting the steps. By the time Ruth opened the door and called him in, Aaron had already hung up. "He asked about you," Ruth said. Eddie stood in the entryway with cold air behind him and salt on his gloves. "What did you tell him?" Ruth looked at him for a long moment. I told him you were still here. That should have been enough to make Eddie pick up the phone. It was not. The years kept moving. Ruth's handwriting grew smaller on the recipe cards. Claire's son learned to walk by pulling himself up on the same chair Aaron had once occupied, until Claire gently moved him away without knowing why it made her chest ache. The house began to whisper around its missing person. A photograph removed from the hallway because it hurt Eddie to pass it. A Christmas stocking folded into a box but never thrown away. A birthday cake baked once, then never again. By the time Ruth became ill, the blue plate had outlived hope and become something harder to name. On her better days, she still insisted on Sunday dinner. On her tired days, Claire cooked while Eddie stood beside the stove, lost and obedient, asking where the salt was though it had been in the same cabinet for 30 years. One September evening, Ruth sat at the table with a blanket over her knees and watched Eddie set Aaron's place. "Do not stop after I am gone," she said. Eddie turned too quickly. "Do not talk like that." Ruth smiled at the plate, not at him. "I am talking like someone who knows you. If you cannot say sorry yet, keep setting the table until you can." Claire was at the sink when she heard it. Her hands were in warm dishwater. Outside, the maple leaves had begun to yellow. She looked at her mother, then at her father, and understood for the first time that the ritual was not only about Aaron. It was about every word Eddie had buried so deep that only a plate could carry it. But Claire also understood something Ruth did not say. Love can leave a light on for one person and still cast a shadow over another. After Ruth was gone, the sink became Claire's place in the house. Eddie had the head of the table. Aaron had the empty chair. Ruth had the recipe cards taped inside the cabinet, her looping handwriting fading near the edges where steam had reached it year after year. Claire had the sink, the dish towel, the warm water, and the quiet work of cleaning up after a grief no one had invited her to name. The first Sunday dinner without her mother felt less like a meal than a rehearsal for a life none of them wanted. Eddie overcooked the roast because he kept opening the oven door. Claire mashed the potatoes too smooth because she was afraid to stop moving. Noah, only a boy then, colored at the counter and tried to be good in the careful way children do when a house feels breakable. When Eddie set the blue plate at Aaron's chair, Claire almost told him not to. The words rose in her, sharp and tired, but then she saw his hand hover over the napkin. He looked suddenly helpless. A man who had spent his whole life fixing loose hinges and bad breaks in school bus mirrors, and now could not fix the one thing that had mattered most. So Claire said nothing. She carried the green beans to the table. She poured iced tea. She cut Noah's meat into small pieces. She ate 3 bites and tasted none of them. After dinner, Eddie sat alone in the living room with the television on low, not watching it. Noah fell asleep on the couch with one sock half off. Claire stood at the sink and washed 4 plates, though only 3 people had eaten. The blue one was clean already, as it always was. That made it worse. A dirty plate at least proved someone had been there. This one only proved that hope could be washed, dried, and put back in the cabinet without ever being used. Claire held it under the warm water anyway. She rubbed the sponge over the crack near the rim. She remembered Aaron laughing in that chair, flicking a pea at her when Ruth turned around, fixing her old station wagon for free after Daniel said the repair shop would charge too much. She remembered him lifting Noah as a baby the one time he visited before the final silence stretched too wide. There had been love there. That was what made the absence so complicated. If Aaron had been only selfish, if Eddie had been only cruel, if Ruth had been only right, then Claire might have known where to put her anger. Instead, it moved through the house with nowhere decent to rest. Some Sundays, she was angry at Aaron for leaving her to become the dependable one. Some Sundays, she was angry at Eddie for loving the missing son so loudly in silence and the present daughter so quietly in duty. Some Sundays, she was angry at Ruth for turning a wound into a ritual and then leaving Claire to keep drying it. Years passed, and Claire kept showing up. She replaced the batteries in Eddie's smoke detectors. She brought casseroles and foil pans. She drove him to his eye appointments and sat in plastic waiting room chairs under fluorescent lights while he pretended not to need help reading the forms. She cleaned the gutters one October while Eddie stood below and told her she was doing it wrong. She came every Sunday, even after Daniel moved out, even after Noah left for college, even after the house seemed to hold more ghosts than furniture. And still, when dinner came, Eddie's eyes always drifted first toward the empty chair. One evening, While rinsing the blue plate, Claire finally set it down too hard in the sink. It did not break. It only made a sound sharp enough to bring Eddie to the kitchen doorway. "Careful," he said. Claire looked at him over the steam rising from the water. For a long moment, she saw not just her father, but the whole arrangement of their lives. Aaron absent. Ruth remembered. Eddie waiting. Claire working. "I stayed, Dad," she said. The sentence came out quietly, but it changed the air in the room. Eddie opened his mouth, then closed it. The kitchen clock ticked above them. The blue plate sat between her hands, clean, shining, and heavier than any dish had a right to be. Claire waited for him to say he knew. She waited for him to say he was sorry. She waited for him to look at her the way he looked at that chair. But Eddie only lowered his eyes, because the truth had reached him before the courage did. And somewhere in the house, hidden in a drawer Ruth used to call the everything drawer, there was already a letter that proved he had known for years how much needed to be said. The everything drawer was the kind of place every old kitchen had, a shallow wooden drawer beside the stove filled with rubber bands, dead batteries, church bulletins, takeout menus, pencils without erasers, and keys no one could match to any lock. Ruth had named it years ago with a laugh, saying every family needed one place where the things that did not belong anywhere else could still be kept. After she died, Eddie stopped opening it unless he had to. It smelled faintly of paper, cinnamon, and the hand lotion Ruth used every winter. Claire found the letter there on a Thursday afternoon in late October, while searching for a screwdriver small enough to tighten the handle on the cabinet under the sink. Eddie was in the living room, asleep in his recliner with the news murmuring low. Rain moved down the kitchen window in thin silver lines. The house was quiet, not peaceful, just quiet. Claire slid the drawer open and began moving through the clutter, annoyed at first, then careful when she saw the envelope beneath a stack of expired coupons. It had Aaron's name on it. The handwriting was Eddie's, stiff and slanted, the way he wrote when he was trying to make his letters look stronger than his hand felt. The envelope had never been sealed. Claire stood very still. There are moments when a person knows they are holding something private and opens it anyway because the silence has cost too much. She unfolded the letter slowly. The paper had yellowed at the crease. At the top, Eddie had written the date, March 14th, 2012, 3 years after Aaron left. The first line stopped Claire before she reached the second. "I was wrong before I knew how to say it." She read it again. The words did not sound like the father she knew at the dinner table, the man who corrected weather reports and pretended medical bills were smaller than they were. They sounded like someone speaking from a locked room inside him. In the letter, Eddie did not make excuses. Not many. He wrote that he had mistaken fear for principle. He wrote that Aaron's leaving had taken him back to a morning he had never explained. He wrote that no son should have to carry his father's old abandonment like a debt. He wrote that the plate was still set every Sunday, though he knew a plate was not the same as an apology. Claire lowered herself into the chair by the counter. Her chest hurt, not from surprise exactly, but from the unfairness of discovering that a person had been capable of saying the right thing and still had not said it out loud. Beneath the first letter was another envelope, this one sealed, stamped, and marked in red with return to sender. The address was in Pittsburgh, but one number had been written wrong. Claire stared at it until the mistake became obvious. Apartment 3B had been written as 8B. Such a small error. One crooked loop. One careless number. A whole family could build a wall around something that small if pride carried the bricks. Eddie had kept the returned letter for years. Maybe as proof that he had tried. Maybe as punishment. Maybe because trying once and failing felt safer than trying again and being refused on purpose. Claire heard the recliner creak in the living room. She folded the letter quickly, but Eddie was already standing in the doorway, one hand against the frame, his eyes on the paper in her lap. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The rain tapped softly. The kitchen clock clicked forward. "You found it," he said. Claire did not apologize. "Why did you never send it again?" Eddie looked toward Aaron's chair as if the answer might be sitting there after all these years. "Because it came back," he said. "No," Claire replied, holding up the envelope with the wrong apartment number. "It got lost." Eddie closed his eyes. The difference between those two things entered him slowly, then all at once. And 200 miles away, in a small apartment outside Pittsburgh, Aaron had been keeping his own proof that home had not forgotten him, even though he believed the door had been closed from the inside. In Pittsburgh, Aaron Callahan lived in a second-floor apartment above a closed barber shop, where the windows rattled when delivery trucks passed and the radiator hissed through most of January. It was not the life he had imagined at 19, but it was his, built one repair job and one paid bill at a time. He worked at a diesel garage on the edge of the city, where the air smelled of oil, cold metal, and coffee left too long on a burner. Men brought him engines that coughed and stalled, and Aaron listened to them the way Ruth once said he listened to broken things, with patience first and tools second. He was good at his work. He was good at arriving early. He was good at making sure Grace had clean clothes, school lunches, and enough quiet in the evenings to do her homework. What he was not good at was talking about Mill Creek. Grace knew the town only through fragments. A house with a maple tree. A mother named Ruth who made pot roast with carrots cut thick. A sister named Claire who used to braid her hair before church and pretend she hated being teased. A father who drove a yellow school bus and believed roads were safer when people came back from them. Aaron never said Eddie was cruel. He never said he hated him. In some ways, that made the story harder to understand. Children learn not only from what parents say, but from the rooms they do not enter. For Grace, Mill Creek became one of those rooms. She first noticed the blue cup when she was 7. It sat on the highest shelf in their small kitchen, pushed behind coffee mugs from auto parts stores and a chipped Pirates cup someone had given Aaron at work. He never used it. Once, when Grace climbed onto a chair to reach it, Aaron crossed the kitchen faster than she had ever seen him move and said, "Careful with that." Not loud, not angry, just scared. After that, she knew it mattered. Years later, when she was old enough to ask better questions, he told her it had belonged to a set from home. "Why did you only take the cup?" she asked. Aaron had smiled in a way that did not reach far. "Because I was young and proud, and because I thought if I took the plate too, there would be nothing left for me there." Grace did not understand then. Not fully, but she understood enough to watch him on Sundays. Most weeks, Aaron cooked simple things after long shifts: grilled cheese, tomato soup, eggs with toast, pasta from a box. But on certain Sundays, especially when rain touched the windows, he cooked Ruth's pot roast from memory. He browned the meat in a heavy pan, added carrots, onions, potatoes, and just enough black pepper. He never wrote the recipe down. He said some things stayed in the hands. The first time Grace smelled the same meal from the porch of the Callahan house in Mill Creek. Years later, she knew before anyone opened the door that she had reached the right place. The smell moved through the screen like a memory that did not belong to her, and still somehow did. She had come because Aaron had driven as far as the edge of town and then sat in the car outside a gas station with both hands on the steering wheel, unable to go farther. He had told her the house was being sold. Claire had found him online after discovering the returned letter, sending one short message that said, "Dad has been setting your place for 17 years. Aaron read it 3 times and said nothing for almost an hour. Then he took the blue cup from the shelf, wrapped it in a dish towel, and gave it to Grace. "I do not know if I can walk in first," he told her, "but this can." So Grace stood on the porch at dusk, holding the cup in both hands, breathing in Ruth's recipe from a kitchen she had never seen. And when Claire opened the door, when Eddie looked across the room and saw the cup beside the waiting plate, all the years between Mill Creek and Pittsburgh became smaller than the space from the porch to the table. Grace did not sit right away. She stood beside the table with her hands empty now, as if setting down the cup had taken more strength than carrying it across 200 miles. Eddie kept looking at the cup, then at her face, then back to the cup again, trying to make the pieces of the room obey time. The girl was Aaron's daughter. The cup was Aaron's proof. The plate was his own quiet apology. And somehow, for 17 years, every person involved had been speaking a different language to an empty chair. Claire pulled out the chair beside her, not Aaron's chair, but the one across from it. "You can sit down," she said gently. Grace nodded and lowered herself into the seat. Her eyes moved to Ruth's recipe cards inside the cabinet door. "My dad makes that roast," she said. "Not often. Only when he is missing something." Eddie's face tightened at the word missing. "He remembers the recipe?" Grace gave a small smile. "He says Grandma Ruth never measured right. She measured by whether the kitchen smelled like people would stay." Claire looked down at the table. For years, she had believed memory belonged mostly to the house, to the person who stayed behind and kept dusting the same chair. It had never occurred to her that memory could also live in a small Pittsburgh apartment, and a man cooking carrots too thick, because that was how his mother had done it. Eddie pulled out a chair slowly and sat, not at the head of the table, but beside the blue plate. He seemed smaller there. Did he know? He asked. His voice was rough. Grace understood what he meant. She looked at the plate, then at Eddie. No, sir. Not until Aunt Claire messaged him. The word aunt landed softly, but Claire felt it. Grace turned toward her. I am sorry. I did not know about you until a few years ago. Not really. He said your name sometimes, but he always stopped like it hurt. Claire folded her hands in her lap. The apology was not the one she needed, but it was the first one that had entered the room without being forced. Eddie stared at the water glass beside Aaron's plate. He thought I meant it, he said. Grace did not answer too quickly. She had Aaron's carefulness, the same habit of listening before touching what was broken. He remembered the exact words, she said. He told me once that a person can leave a house and still hear one sentence for the rest of his life. Eddie closed his eyes. The kitchen seemed to lean around him. All those Sundays, he had believed the plate said come home. But Aaron, far away, had been living under the sentence that told him there was no place to return to. The sorrow of it was not loud. It did not knock anything over. It simply sat down at the table with them, making room for every year they had lost to pride, fear, and one wrong number on an envelope. I wrote to him, Eddie said, though even he heard how small it sounded. Claire looked at the returned letter on the counter, the red stamp faded but still plain. Grace followed Claire's eyes and saw it. He never got that, she said. Eddie nodded once, slowly, because the truth was no longer something he could defend against. I know that now. Grace reached for the blue cup and turned it so the chipped side faced the plate. He kept this where he could see it. He said he did not want to forget the table, even if the table had forgotten him. Eddie's hand covered his mouth for a moment. Claire watched her father, and for the first time in years, her anger made room for pity without disappearing. He had not been innocent, but he had been trapped inside a mistake he kept mistaking for punishment. Then Grace looked past them toward the front window. Her posture changed. Claire followed her gaze. Outside, beyond the porch light and the leaning for sale sign, a man stood near the maple tree with both hands in the pockets of his work jacket. Looking at the house as if he had reached the edge of a country he was no longer sure he had the right to enter. Aaron Callahan did not come to the door like a man returning home. He came like a man approaching a room where a verdict had been waiting for 17 years. From the kitchen window, Claire could see the slope of his shoulders beneath a dark work jacket, the gray at his temples, the hands he kept buried in his pockets as if he did not trust them not to shake. He was 36 now, older than Eddie had been when Claire first understood that fathers could be frightened and still look stern. But standing beneath the maple tree, Aaron looked briefly 19 again, caught between leaving and being called back. Grace rose first. Dad, she said softly, though the glass kept her voice inside. Aaron looked toward the window and saw her. Then he saw Claire beside her. Then Eddie. The old house seemed to grow very still around the sight of him. Eddie pushed himself up from the chair, slower than he wanted to, one hand pressing against the table. The movement scraped the floor just enough to make everyone hear how hard it was for him to stand before the son he had spent half his life missing and almost no part of it finding. Claire went to the door. She did not rush. There are some moments a family has to enter carefully, the way a person enters a church after years away. When she opened it, the cool Ohio evening moved into the hallway. Aaron stood at the bottom of the porch steps, rain from earlier still shining on the boards. He looked at Claire first. His mouth opened, but no word came out. She saw the brother who had teased her, the boy who had left her, the man who had stayed gone because one sentence had built a locked room around him. You got older, she said. Aaron let out a small breath that almost became a laugh. So did you. It was not enough. It was almost nothing. But it was something living, and the house had gone a long time without that. Grace stepped past Claire and touched Aaron's arm. He saw the cup, she said. Aaron looked through the doorway then. Eddie stood in the kitchen, framed by warm light, with the blue plate behind him and Ruth's recipe cards above his shoulder. Father and son looked at each other across the narrow hallway. Not across a table this time. Not across pride. Just across the distance that remained after the years had done their damage. Eddie took one step forward. Aaron, he said. The name sounded unused, not unloved. Aaron looked down at the porch. I was not sure I should come in. Eddie nodded, and that nod carried more shame than any speech could have held. I gave you reason to think that. Claire watched her father's hand close around the doorframe. For once, he did not reach for the table, the plate, the ritual, or the silence. He reached for words. There was always a place for you, Eddie said. His voice broke only at the edge, and he steadied it before continuing. I was too proud to say it, too afraid to ask you back, too ashamed after that letter came home. But I need you to know this before you decide anything else. I was wrong before you ever left the driveway. Aaron stood very still. Grace moved closer to him, but she did not speak for him. That mattered. The porch light hummed above them. A car passed slowly on Maple Street, its tires whispering over damp pavement, then disappeared. Aaron lifted his eyes to his father. You told me I did not have a place at the table. Eddie swallowed. I know. I heard it for 17 years. I know. I taught myself not to need one. Eddie looked toward the kitchen, where the blue plate sat waiting beside the cup Grace had carried in. I said it anyway, he said. Not because that fixed it. It did not. Not because you owed me anything. You did not. I said it because your mother told me to let the plate say what I could not. But she was wrong about one thing. His eyes returned to Aaron. A plate cannot apologize for a man forever. Claire felt the sentence move through the house like a window opening. Aaron looked past Eddie to the table. The cup and plate were finally together, blue beside blue, both chipped, both kept, both older than the anger that had separated them. For a moment, no one moved. Then Aaron climbed one step. The wood gave a familiar creak under his boot. Eddie heard it and closed his eyes, as if the house had remembered before any of them knew how. Aaron stopped at the threshold and looked at Claire. I should have called you, he said. Claire's throat tightened, but she did not let him look away. Yes, she answered. Not cruelly. Truthfully. Aaron nodded. I am sorry. The words did not repair 17 years. They only placed the first board across them. Claire stepped back from the doorway. Eddie stepped back too. And Aaron Callahan, who had carried a blue cup through half his life like proof of a home he believed he had lost, finally crossed into the kitchen where his plate had been waiting. Aaron did not sit at first. He stood beside the table with one hand on the back of the chair beneath the window, the same chair that had kept his shape in the family's memory long after the rest of him had become rumor, regret, and unanswered mail. The blue plate waited in front of him. The blue cup sat beside it, chipped handle turned toward his right hand the way Ruth used to place it when he was late from the garage and pretending he was not hungry. For a long moment, Aaron only looked at them. Eddie stood across the table, no longer at the head of it, because something in him understood that authority had no place in this moment. Claire remained by the sink, arms folded, watching not as a referee, not as the daughter who cleaned up afterward, but as someone whose own hurt had finally been allowed to stand in the room. Grace stayed near her father's shoulder, quiet and careful, old enough to understand that some doors open slowly because everyone on both sides has been afraid of what they might find. Mom kept setting it first, Eddie said. After she was gone, I kept doing it because I did not know how to stop waiting, and I did not know how to start saying what I owed you. Aaron pulled the chair out. The sound of the wooden legs against the kitchen floor moved through Eddie like a memory, returning with shoes on. Aaron sat down. No one spoke. The house seemed to listen. Eddie reached for the serving fork, then stopped. His hand hovered over the roast, as if even dinner needed permission now. Aaron saw it and gave a small nod. That was all. Eddie served him one slice, then potatoes, then green beans, each movement ordinary enough to break the heart. Ruth had been right about one thing. Food could open a door, but it could not walk through it for them. They had to do that part themselves. Claire brought another glass of water and set it near Grace. Then she sat down too, not in Ruth's old place, not in Aaron's shadow, but in the chair beside her brother. Aaron turned to her. I left you with too much, he said. Claire looked at the table, then at him. You did. The truth did not make the room colder. It made it breathable. I was angry for a long time, she said. Some days I still am. Aaron nodded. I can live with the truth better than silence. Eddie closed his eyes for a moment, because that sentence belonged to all of them. After dinner, nobody rushed to clear the table. The roast cooled. The ice melted in the glasses. Outside, the porch light glowed over the for sale sign, and the maple tree moved gently in the Ohio dark. Eddie reached into his shirt pocket and took out the folded letter Claire had found in the drawer. The paper shook slightly in his hand. He placed it beside Aaron's plate. This should have reached you years ago, he said. Aaron did not open it right away. He rested his palm on top of it, as if feeling the weight of all the years it had traveled without moving. "I will read it," he said, "but not instead of hearing you." So Eddie spoke. Not beautifully, not perfectly. He stumbled. He stopped twice. He admitted the fear he had mistaken for strength, the pride he had mistaken for fatherhood, the old wound he had handed to his son without meaning to. Aaron listened. Claire listened. Grace listened. And somewhere in the silence left by Ruth Callahan, the kitchen seemed less empty than it had in years. The house was still going to be sold, though not that week. The lost years did not return because one chair was filled. Claire would not become light overnight. Aaron would not stop hearing the old sentence by morning. Eddie would still wake some Sundays with shame sitting beside him before coffee. But that night, after the dishes were finally washed, Aaron dried the blue plate and placed it in the cabinet himself. Then he set the blue cup beside it, not as proof of exile anymore, as proof that something broken had been kept long enough to be brought home. Before leaving, Aaron paused at the porch and looked back into the kitchen. Eddie stood by the table. Claire turned off the stove light. Grace carried Ruth's recipe card carefully in her phone, a picture of handwriting she had inherited late, but not too late. For 17 years, that plate had waited for a son. On that final Sunday in the old arrangement of their lives, it held more than food. It held the truth a family had finally become brave enough to serve.